to be our strength, and nothing of this world. Though it may seem as it is everlasting, though it may seem as though it is imposing, that these things are really nothing in light of you. And please use me to be an encouragement to your body, that they would be blessed and ministered to. We do also pray for those who are lost, that they could see need to trust you before it would be too late for them, that they could see that their help too comes from the Lord, and He has made Himself available to all, and He is sufficient for all things, very much so, including the salvation of their souls. And we ask these things in your wonderful name, for you're so worthy. Amen. Psalm 121. We'll begin reading here in verse 1. It says, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. He shall preserve thy soul. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. We'll start with verse 8. This psalm is a pilgrim's psalm. And it goes in line with kind of the trend that we have been falling into as of late of many of these messages. I guess I can't quite seem to get it out just right. The Lord keeps giving me a few more opportunities to try. But a lot of these messages have centered around an eternal frame of mind, a frame of mind that is transfixed entirely on God and on God alone. And this psalm is one that is given from the perspective of a pilgrim. This is something that we have talked about recently, how that we are strangers and pilgrims in this world, that we are not of here. This is not our home. This is not our inheritance. This is not our eternity. This is not the place that we lay up treasures, but this is the place that we are traveling through. And this psalm is written to encourage the lowly traveler in a very dangerous place that they find themselves in which we do find ourselves in a very dangerous place in this world. And as that pilgrim that is traveling through this very dangerous place, we have help. And it is not a mind-boggling or just earth-shattering revelation to us for me to tell you that your help comes from God. You need to cleave to God. However, it is a very earth-shattering revelation whenever we trust that fact, whenever we understand the help that God offers. His help is plenteous. And in this psalm, he writes in verse 1, and there's a lot of interpretations of verse 1, but he seems to be correcting himself in verse 2. In verse 1, I understand it reads as though that is a statement, but whenever we take it in context with verse 2, you see him kind of taking a step back and correcting his frame of mind. Remember, he says, I will lift up mine eyes into the hills from whence cometh my help. And then he steps back and says, my help cometh from the Lord. You see, whenever we look into the Old Testament, there is something about the high places, the hills, the mountains, this word could also be translated as. And it's used, I forget the number, 70 some odd times in reference to idolatry. That whenever you read and study of the history of Israel, as we have here on Friday nights, that you remember that they would build altars in the high places, that they would sacrifice in the high places, in the groves, that they would worship these false gods. And you can even go to the book of Numbers and you can read. There, I believe that I've referenced these scriptures somewhat recently of Balaam, and how that I believe it was the Moabites, it was one of those in the land of Canaan that they wanted God's people destroyed as they were making their way to the promised land. They had not yet entered in. They're still being led by Moses. And he brings in this, what he perceives to be a prophet of God named Balaam. And God uses him. And he wants Balaam to curse Israel. And he goes and he says, I can only say what God bids me to say. And he blesses Israel.
And this happens 3 times, but in all 3 times it says that they go to a different place, and this place is actually higher up into the mountains. That is a higher elevation. It was a pagan mindset of the higher I can get, the closer I am to God. This is why that's where they worshiped. And this is not necessarily something that happened with the Jews. That's not a godly understanding. And so there's something about the hills and lifting up your eyes. It was very much a culture of pagan ideology. And even still today, that there is something that is very overwhelming about these massive structures. If you ever get the opportunity to be in a mountainous area, that they're very old, they feel very old, they feel very immovable. And though that we have carved out highways and interstates through these places that they wind and they go round and round, and sometimes it feels like you're about riding on a roller coaster, driving down the road. They seem to be incomparable places. And here is, as this psalm was written, and it's written by one who's very clearly overwhelmed. It says whenever he's looking out for help, he lifts up his eyes to the hills. But then he realizes that's not where my help comes from. My help truly, in verse 2, comes from the Lord, which made the heaven, made the earth. You know, part of the earth are those mountains that they were looking up to. But there is one beyond that which we can see that we look to for help. And so these mountains, that they are definitely a symbol of various different things. There's various different ways in which we can think about these. You know, for one, as we already talked about, those places of idolatry, or in a more recent context, a place of worldly security. I understand that you would not be offering up sacrifices to idols, but as we look up and try to find help, we often look up in all the wrong places. We look up at the ideas that are elevated by this world. We look up to the good advice of this world and the wisdom of this world, and it is set up on a pedestal for us to all strive towards, but it's no real help. And so in that sense, that we can be led astray. In another sense, that these mountains being very overwhelming structures that they could very much represent, if you're of a Christian mindset, those same worldly systems that we're fighting against. They seem to be incomparable. Just speaking of military tactics, these cities that were set within these mountains were very secure cities, very difficult cities to go and to overthrow, and that's why very small groups of people could last for so long if they found just the right spot. And for us who are fighting against these systems of this world, it feels as though that we're fighting against something that cannot be penetrated into, but our help comes from God, from the one who, it says, is the creator of heaven and earth itself, the one who has authority over all things. He writes here that, in verse 3, that he will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He won't allow you to slip. And this place that we work in, this place that we pilgrim through, this life we live, how often to you does it seem as though that life is this thing that you stumble from one obstacle to the next? It feels as though that just as soon as you get your footing underneath you, that there's another obstacle that causes you to stumble, and there's something else that causes you to nearly fall, and it feels as though that we're running this race, and I don't know if you've ever seen some of those hurdle races in which all the people are going and jumping over the hurdles, and from time to time you can find somebody who's not very good at it, and it seems like they hit every single one and they're dragging them behind them. Sometimes life feels like that, in which we can just almost make it over and we just about recover and we're falling again. And this is a very weirdly isolating feeling, to just struggle. And I say weirdly isolating because it's a shared experience. To be honest that you are not the only person that feels like they're stumbling from one obstacle to the next, and one problem to the next in this life. And you know, what happens, if we're talking about being distracted by something, what happens is these mountains, so to speak, these places that we try to find help, and these things that seem to be overwhelming us, we get distracted by a carnal sense of mind. And what I mean by that is everything that happens in this world, it has some sort of a spiritual connection to it. And I don't mean that in a mystic sense. I think some people can get carried away by this idea. However, what happens is, as we are supposed to be fighting a spiritual warfare, that our enemy does something in which he takes very non-spiritual looking things to overwhelm us and distract us. And we see this play out in the scriptures. You know, the Job is the crowning example, right? Satan was pouring out everything he could, everything he was allowed to do against Job. And it wasn't weird, spooky things, and it wasn't haunted houses, and it wasn't demonic activity the way that we would think of it. It was disease, boils from head to toe. And it was natural disasters. The death of his family from when the wind caused the house to collapse on them. And it was financial hardship as all of his flocks were overtaken by the Chaldeans. And it was emotional turmoil as his wife would come to him and just tell him to curse God and die, the one person who was supposed to be left to encourage him in the world, who didn't want to any longer. And it was emotional turmoil in the sense of his friends that had journeyed that great long way and sat with him for a week without uttering a word, who one by one told Job that he was actually in the wrong and gave Job horrible advice, told that they were, by Job's own confession, miserable comforters. You know, none of that looked spiritual. Everything was done for Satan to prove a point that Job just liked God because God was good to him. It was a spiritual warfare that took place in a carnal sense, and had Job gotten distracted, and he'd taken his eyes off of the one place that he could find help, he would have felt utterly abandoned. In fact, he felt abandoned. But he would cleave to a truth that was beyond that which his feelings tried to betray him with. He would write how that he looked left and right and up and down, forward and backwards. He would look all over the place and did not find God. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that he's there, even whenever I don't necessarily feel that he is there. And in that instance, he did not slip. He didn't stumble. It sure felt like it was. He sure felt as though that he was not overwhelmingly conquering some of those obstacles that would stand in his way, much so as it does with us. However, whenever our eyes are fixed to the one that can actually help us, we don't slip. We slip whenever we fix our eyes on this world. You know, in Psalm 73, there's a similar language that's used. If you would turn there just a few pages back. Psalm 73, Psalm of Asaph, and he, as he wrote that this is, it's a very graphic depiction of one who is deceived, one who falls. Psalm 73 and verse 2. Psalm 73 and verse 2 says, but as for me, my feet were almost gone. My steps had well nigh slipped. Asaph wrote of a time in which he almost gave up. He was just a moment away from slipping and falling, of turning his back on the Lord. And why was that? Well, he tells us in verse 3, for I was envious of the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. And he goes on to write that Asaph goes on to confess that my eyes were fixed on this world. My eyes were fixed on the wicked and how that they seem to prosper in all their ways. That it says, for there are no bands in their death, and their strength is firm. They're not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. That he looked around, instead of looking to where his help would come from, he would look around, and what he found was something that discouraged him so much that he almost stumbled and fell. His feet had well nigh slipped, he wrote. And that slipping was a discouragement that nearly caused him to give up. Now, this issue is not a new issue. We see it plainly written in the Scriptures. That's why there's so much comfort found in the Scriptures. And so trusting fully in God for endurance is the difference between the one who gives up and the one who doesn't. That's the only difference. You know, we can compare the books of... Take the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. Vastly different books. The book of Joshua, there was one hang-up in chapter 7 whenever Achan brought sin into the camp. Other than that, it was easy going. And if you go, and we make a lot of that, by the way. If you go and you read that account, in terms of war, very few casualties at that battle. A handful of folks started dying, and they weren't used to it and turned around. You know, whenever you read of that coming off of some of the Pentateuch, that, you know, a plague would come in and wipe out 20,000 folks in the course of a day. That's kind of where your mind might be at, as they would go into battle at Ai with Achan sin in the camp and get routed, but it really wasn't even nearly that bad. One small hang-up from sin. Other than that, overwhelming victory. That's the book of Joshua. And they endured, and they conquered. You go to the book of Judges, and they constantly had to get bailed out. Constantly. You know why that was? Their eyes went from the Lord who was their strength to the false gods that they wanted to make their strength. The false gods who offered the fun, the temporary fun of sin. The temporary pleasures that it has to bring. And they failed. The difference of the endurance, the difference in the results was that in Joshua's day, their eyes were fixed on God. It's the difference between Saul and David. You know, Saul was a very miserable man, very sinful man, a man who in the end of his days was bitter, and murderous. And then you look at David, and well, David endured. However, along the way, there was plenty of bumps. Whether or not, that there were times in which David was a murderous individual. David would have made Saul proud in his dealings with Uriah. But the difference, the reason that David endured, and that on his final days that he was giving his son advice to cleave to the Lord, the reason that David is remembered as a good king and Saul as an evil one, the difference was the man David sought his strength from the Lord. And the man Saul sought his strength from Saul. He got distracted. The difference between Demas and Mark, if you go to the New Testament, very similar statements are made of the two. Demas and John Mark, if I've got my names correct, were two who departed the faith, that they fled. And concerning Demas, it said that he in my own words, that he enjoyed the pleasures of this world. That was why he turned back. And John Mark, similarly, it seems it's kind of written as though that they got up to go labor, and John Mark wasn't there anymore. He fled. But you know, later on in the New Testament, you find John Mark again. You don't find Demas. You find Paul sending for John Mark. Demas, he was gone. Why did one come back and the other didn't? It's where their strength was. Demas loved the present world. John Mark got scared. He sinned. He fled. He had a moment of weakness. But he endured. And endurance doesn't always look pretty. It's not always picture perfect. And that's not to make an excuse, but our flesh stumbles and falls. If we want to endure, and we have to endure, it boils down to this one key thing that differentiates us, in which our help cometh from the Lord, as verse 2 of Psalm 121 tells us. And once again, whenever that happens, we don't slip. He goes on to write of how that God preserves them. It says that he preserves them from all evil. If you go and you look, and he writes even before that of not sleeping, that he would say, he in verse 3, he will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. And that God won't sleep. And there's a costly mistake that is not new to make. And that is that just this assumption that God doesn't really know what's going on in my life. He doesn't really know the torment of my soul. If he really knew it, he would do something different. That's a costly mistake. That's one that makes us slip. That's one that makes us fall. It's one that gets us discouraged, often beyond repair, and it's one that is as old as time. In the book of Isaiah, this was actually covered, and God becomes very transparent here. Isaiah chapter 40, if you would turn. Isaiah chapter 40. Verse 27. Isaiah 40 and verse 27. God would confront Israel and ask them, why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel, my way is hid from the Lord, and my judgment is passed over from my God. Why hast thou not known? Hast thou not heard? That the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. There's no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increaseth strength. Even a youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. God confronts Israel and asks them, why is it that you think your way is hid from God? And that was just the frame of mind that Israel was in, that there were some hardships that they were enduring, and they just said, well, God just must not see our affliction. And God gives us a little reminder of who he is. This verse is a verse that's kind of frequented, especially in this chapter of Isaiah, but through the book of Isaiah, there are very similar statements to this that are made often. And there are very sobering statements, they're very convicting statements whenever we are the ones that feel as though that our affliction is hid from the Lord. Where he says, hast thou not known? Or in my own words, did you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, not just God, little g, but the everlasting God, the one who is the Lord, the one who is the creator of the ends of the earth. You know, he doesn't faint. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't run out of breath. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't slumber. He's not like you and I. You know, this reminds me very much of the scene that unfolds with Elijah on Mount Carmel. And at Mount Carmel, that there was a bit of a competition that went on between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And there that the prophets of Baal would try to get their gods to call down fire from heaven. And they go through this whole rigmarole. And Elijah makes some statements that he's kind of mocking them. And he says, perhaps your God's out on a long journey and hasn't returned. Perhaps your God is asleep. Cry a little louder and maybe he'll wake up and answer your plea. That's their gods. The gods who aren't real. God is not like that. He's one who doesn't sleep. He doesn't grow tired. He doesn't need to rest his eyes for a little while. And that's a great comfort too, because sometimes, not just in terms of a physical fatigue, not just in terms of of just getting sleepy, but you know, sometimes it feels to us as though that God is just kind of tired of us, that He's grown weary with us. That there is a song that my aunt will sing from time to time in Social. It's Me Again, Lord. And in that is this one who goes to God in prayer. It's me again. It's me again. And I so much appreciate that song. And it captures both the grace of God and His willingness to hear and answer our prayers, but also this feeling of I have to go to God again and again. I have a problem I can't solve. It says that there's so much weakness within me, and thank God that He doesn't grow weary with my petitions. He doesn't grow weary with my coming to Him. He's a God who doesn't faint, a God who doesn't sleep, one who always listens, one who preserves us. He's on high alert at all times. And again, he writes that He preserves us. That He preserves us. As I made mention just a moment ago in verse 4. Back in Psalm 121. In verse 7, the Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. All evil. That's a big statement to make. And if you are a child of God in this life, it certainly feels as though that evil has overtaken you. That perhaps maybe God has failed to preserve you from all evil. And sure, we feel the effects of evil. We feel the effects of harm. But whenever our eyes are fixed on the Lord, we don't fall by them. Those soul-rending impacts that they have, they're all guarded by that armor of God that we're given to put on. You know, what is the worst thing that can happen to us? Whenever we think of that question, I understand it's a dangerous question to ask sometimes. What's the worst that can happen? Probably the worst one we think sometimes. However, in an eternal frame of mind, what is the worst thing that can fall on us? I guess the loss of life, suffering, maybe something worse than death, loss of someone else's life. That would probably be the worst thing that could happen to me. But whenever we take a step back and we look, why is that so bad to us? It's so bad because we're stuck in this place and we're treating this place as that eternal home that we have. The loss of life is so bad because it feels to us as though that it is a permanent thing. The loss of our life is so bad to us because it feels as though that's the end of it all. But whenever we're taking a godly view of things, the worst thing that can happen is that in this temporary life, with this temporary flesh that we walk around with, it ends just a little bit sooner. You know, this life is defined as a vapor. And a vapor goes out very quick. And so what if that vapor lasts half the time? It doesn't really make a difference whenever we're bringing out the scale of time. And whenever we understand that if you are a saved child of God, that your soul is kept by the power of God for all of eternity, and that you are going, whenever you leave this place, to be with God forevermore. A temporary body that is feeling some temporary pain, or leaves a temporary earth just a little sooner than it otherwise would have, that's not evil falling on us. I think Paul writes this in a very sobering way in the book of 2 Corinthians. If you would, turn with me to the book of 2 Corinthians in chapter 5. Second Corinthians chapter 5. We'll begin reading in verse 1. It says, "For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, and house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon, whether a house which is from heaven. If so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we that are in this tabernacle, that is our flesh, do groan, being burdened. Not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now, we're going to continue to read, but that's a depiction of death that is not nearly as near to our hearts and understanding. Death is this departure. However, we read in Christ of a day that is coming in which he comes, and that death is finally and fully swallowed up in victory, 1 Corinthians 15 tells us. And in that we have a promise that this departure from the tabernacle is not necessarily an unclothing, but a clothing upon. That is not that we are losing, but gaining. It says, and again in verse 4, for we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not for that we should be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now he that hath wrought us for the selfsame thing is God, who also hath given unto us the earnest of the Spirit. Therefore we are always confident, knowing that whilst we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Wherefore, or because of this, we labor, that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he had done, whether good or bad. You see, he writes here of his confidence. He's confident in knowing that while I am at home in the body, in this tabernacle, I'm absent from the Lord, but to be absent from this body is to be present with God. So if we look at whenever we talk about being preserved from all evil, what is the worst evil that can fall on us, in my mind, is some sort of suffering or the loss of another person's life, or maybe the loss of our life. And in all of those events, so long as the person knows the Lord, it is a departure to be in the presence of God. It is a mortality being swallowed up of life. And so what can this world do to us? Those things that we fight against, those things that we be discouraged by. And we've already covered life is discouraging. And we've already covered how that all of these little physical afflictions, these worldly elements that war against us, that kind of in the background, that there's a spiritual working to get us to forsake our God in discouragement. But we're protected from every single one of them in God. It says that he protects our coming and going in Psalm 121, where we read that as we go forth and we come back, that all of our efforts are guarded in the Lord. They're preserved by him. In other words, that they're not done in vain. That whatever happens to us as we go to labor for the Lord, there's nothing that can actually bring us any real harm. And truthfully, the sowing of the seed of God's word is never done in vain. And so everything that we do in God is protected by his mighty hands, the hands who created the heavens and the earth, Psalm 121 reminds us. So we can't be overwhelmed. And I say that to people who I know feel overwhelmed by something. Many of you, and if it's not one of you this morning, I'll talk to you next week. It'll probably be your turn. Or it'll be my turn. Just wait a little while. And not to sound pessimistic, but we live an overwhelming life. And we get overwhelmed because we get distracted. You know, I say this in earnest love. As a child of God, you can't afford to be overwhelmed. You can't afford it. You can't afford to quit. You can't afford discouragement. We are fighting something that matters. Matters more than anything else. And so if you allow these things as overwhelming as they feel, and I know they feel that way. That's why I say this in love. I'm not telling you to rub some dirt on it and get over it. I'm just telling you that in the fight, in the war that you're fighting, the race that you're running, there is no time for quitting. You have to endure. That's why the New Testament spends so much time earnestly imploring that you endure. And in order to do so, you have to lean on a God who has no beginning and no end, who has an endless amount of grace that he can bestow upon you. You can't give up. And God offers you the encouragement to keep going. Seek your help from him. This will be the message. Well, for regards to the invitation.